A luxury private jet sat on the runway under heavy rain. Inside that jet, a black CEO in an expensive suit calmly closed his laptop. He had just finalized a deal that could shake the entire aviation industry. But in the next moment everything changed. The cabin door opened with force. Security personnel entered with cold expressions. No explanation, no respect, no warning. The CEO was pointed at and told to stand up immediately. Passengers looked shocked as the most powerful man on the plane was treated like a criminal. One security officer grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the exit. The CEO did not resist. He simply looked at the airline staff and said nothing. But his silence was heavier than any shout. Outside the plane in the pouring rain, he was left standing alone. His luggage was thrown beside him. The aircraft door closed as if he never mattered. But what nobody on that runway knew was who this man really was. Within minutes he made a single phone call. No anger in his voice, only calm control. And what he said next changed everything. The airline that just humiliated him was about to face a storm far bigger than the weather above them. Do you think they made a mistake by underestimating him just because of how he looked? And the biggest question is this. What kind of power does a man hold when he does not need to shout to destroy an entire system? Inside a private office high above the city, the same CEO sat completely calm while rain hit the glass like scattered bullets. The phone call he made seconds after being thrown off the plane had already triggered silent alarms across multiple financial networks. No shouting. No emotional breakdown. Just one sentence to his legal team. Start the withdrawal process. At first, nobody believed it. Because this man wasn't just a passenger on that flight. He was one of the biggest strategic investors the airline had ever partnered with. Within hours, internal emails inside the airline started flashing red alerts. Contracts were being reviewed at emergency level. Executives were suddenly pulled into crisis meetings. And then the first shock hit. A $5 billion funding pipeline, frozen. The same airline that had security drag him off the plane now realized something terrifying. They hadn't just insulted a passenger. They had humiliated one of their largest financial pillars. On the runway, the crew who had thrown him out were still unaware. They thought it was over. But inside boardrooms, panic was rising fast. One senior executive whispered, "We just lost the deal that was keeping us alive." Meanwhile, the CEO finally stood up from his chair and looked at the city skyline. Not angry. Not emotional. Just focused. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about power, respect, and consequences. A single message appeared on his screen from his legal head. Do you want full termination of all airline partnerships? And for the first time, he paused. Because now the entire industry was about to feel the impact of one decision made on a rainy runway. Here's the question nobody inside the airline dared to ask out loud. Did they just destroy their own future over a moment of disrespect? The emergency board meeting was called within hours, and the atmosphere inside the airline headquarters felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Executives were watching live updates on screens showing contract freezes, investor withdrawals, and legal notices stacking up one after another. Nobody was talking about profits anymore. They were talking about survival. The CEO who had been removed from the plane was now being discussed in a completely different tone. Not as a passenger, but as a financial force capable of collapsing the airline's future expansion plans. One senior board member slammed the table. This cannot be real. We threw him off for a misunderstanding, not knowing who he was. But it wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was escalation. Outside the boardroom, news had already started leaking. A mysterious $5 billion funding withdrawal tied to a major aviation partner. Whispers of internal sabotage. And a security incident involving a high-profile CEO. The airline's stock began to tremble. Meanwhile, the CEO remained silent in his private office. He wasn't watching the chaos emotionally. He was studying it like data. Every reaction from the airline was being tracked. Every apology attempt measured. Then a call came from the airline president himself. His voice was low, careful, almost broken. "We are ready to apologize publicly, name your terms." The room went silent as the CEO listened. For a moment, it felt like the entire situation could end right there. But he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked one simple question. "If I had been a regular passenger, would you still be calling me now?" The line went dead silent. Because nobody had an answer. And that silence said everything. Now the question is this. Is an apology enough when respect was never given in the first place? The airline president sat frozen with the phone still in his hand. That one question from the CEO kept repeating in his mind. "If I had been a regular passenger, would you still be calling me now?" No one in the boardroom spoke. Because everyone knew the truth. The answer was uncomfortable. Outside, reporters were already gathering at the headquarters gates. Something big was happening, and the world was starting to sense it. Inside, lawyers rushed in with urgent papers. Public statement ready, damage control plan ready, crisis response ready. But none of it mattered anymore. Because this wasn't just a PR crisis. It had become a power test. Meanwhile, the CEO finally broke his silence again. This time through a secure video call with the airline board. He appeared calm, dressed the same way as before, no anger in his face. Only control. "You removed me from a flight based on appearance and assumption," he said slowly. "Now tell me, what exactly are you trying to fix? Your reputation, or your mistake?" The room went cold. One executive tried to speak but stopped midway. Because every word now felt like it could make things worse. Then something unexpected happened. A junior board member quietly said, "We didn't just lose money, we lost trust we can never buy back." That sentence hit harder than any legal threat. The CEO leaned back slightly. Not satisfied. Not angry. Just evaluating. Then he asked the final question of this phase. "Do you want this to end as a mistake, or a lesson the entire industry remembers?" Silence again. And this silence decided everything. Because sometimes, the real punishment is not what you lose. It's what you realize too late. Now the biggest question remains. Can money fix what disrespect destroyed, or is the damage already permanent? The airline board finally realized something no spreadsheet was showing clearly. This was no longer about one passenger complaint. It had turned into a global example of power, perception, and consequence. The CEO's words had spread internally like wildfire. Lesson the entire industry remembers. Those words felt heavier than any legal warning. Outside, investors began pulling back quietly. Not out of panic alone, but out of uncertainty. Because if an airline could lose billions over one mistake in judgment, what else was unstable behind the scenes? Inside the headquarters, the tone shifted completely. From defense to survival negotiation. The airline president stood up and made a decision. Prepare a direct in-person meeting. No media. No statements. Just us and him. Meanwhile, the CEO was still in his private space. Watching everything unfold without rushing anything. He wasn't chasing revenge in a loud way. He was letting pressure do its work. Hours later, a secure message arrived. "We are sending a delegation. We want to meet face to face." For the first time, the CEO showed a slight change in expression. Not surprise. Not satisfaction. Just confirmation. Because now the system that once dismissed him was coming back to him willingly. The meeting was set for the next morning. At a neutral location. No security drama this time. No assumptions. Only consequences and negotiation. But before ending the call, the CEO asked one last question. Tell me something, did you come here because you understood respect, or because you lost money? No one answered immediately. And that hesitation said everything again. Now the real question is this. When power changes sides, does apology still mean respect, or just necessity? The next morning arrived with heavy silence in the city. At the neutral meeting venue, security was tight but different this time. No forceful removals. No assumptions. Only controlled tension. The airline delegation arrived first. Suits perfect, faces serious, but eyes tired. They were no longer walking in as decision makers. They were walking in as people trying to fix a collapse they didn't fully understand. Minutes later, the CEO arrived. Same calm presence. Same steady confidence. No need to prove anything. The room was arranged like a negotiation table between equals on paper. But in reality, everyone knew the balance had already shifted. A senior airline executive spoke first. We regret what happened. It was a breakdown in judgment and procedure. A pause followed. Then he continued. We are prepared to restore all partnerships and publicly acknowledge the mistake. All eyes turned to the CEO. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a folder on the table. Inside were documents. Contracts, timelines, financial impact reports, and internal communication records. Not emotional. Just facts. Then he spoke quietly. This is not about restoring partnerships. The room tightened. It is about understanding what happens when systems are built without accountability at the human level. Silence again. The airline president finally spoke, voice lower than before. Then what do you want? The CEO looked at him directly. Not angry. Not aggressive. Just clear. I want changes that ensure this never happens to anyone again. Not just me. That line shifted the entire energy. Because it wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about structure. A long silence followed. Then one board member asked softly. Even after everything, why not just walk away completely? The CEO leaned back slightly. And asked the final question of this phase. If power without respect creates this damage, what happens when it goes uncorrected for years? No one answered. Because everyone already knew the answer. And sometimes the scariest part is realizing the system wasn't broken by one mistake. It was exposed by it. Now the question is this. Can an industry truly change after a $5 billion lesson, or will it repeat the same mistake in a different form? The room stayed silent for several seconds after that question. No one rushed to speak, because anything said too quickly would sound like damage control instead of truth. Outside the glass walls, sunlight hit the city, but inside the atmosphere felt heavier than before. Finally, the airline president broke the silence. We accept that changes are necessary. Structural changes. Not just apologies. He pushed a document forward. A proposed reform plan. New passenger handling policies. Bias prevention training. Executive accountability rules. Independent oversight for security decisions. The CEO slowly looked at it, page by page. No expression of surprise. Only evaluation. Then he spoke. Policies written after a failure are always easy to create. That line cut through the room. He continued calmly. The real question is whether the mindset that caused the failure still exists inside your system. Another silence followed. One of the senior executives shifted uncomfortably. Because that was the part no document could fix. Then the CEO did something unexpected. He closed the folder gently and said, I will not destroy this airline. A visible relief spread across the table. But it didn't last long. Because he raised his hand slightly and added, "Not because I cannot, but because destruction is not the goal." Everyone focused again. He continued, "But I will not continue business as usual either." He leaned forward. "This partnership continues only under one condition." The air tightened instantly. "A fully independent global audit body oversees every passenger treatment protocol. No exceptions. No internal control over it." The board members exchanged looks. It was strict, but not impossible. Then came the final question from the airline president. "And if we agree, will you restore the funding?" The CEO paused for a moment. Not because he was unsure, but because the answer carried weight beyond money. Then he said, "The funding was never the real issue." A pause. "The issue was what you thought you could get away with before consequences arrived." That sentence settled like final judgment. And then he added, "If change is real, funding will follow naturally. If it is not, then money will not save you anyway." The meeting ended without celebration. Without victory speeches. Only understanding that something fundamental had shifted. As the CEO walked out, one executive quietly asked another, "Did we win the funding back, or did we just survive a warning?" And that question stayed unanswered. Because sometimes the biggest impact is not what is taken or given back. It is what people realize about themselves too late. Now tell me this. Do you think true change comes from fear of loss, or from real understanding of respect? Outside the building, the wind felt different now, less like chaos, more like aftershock. The deal wasn't officially fixed yet, but something far more important had already shifted inside the airline. For the first time, internal teams were not talking about damage control. They were talking about prevention. Not how to save reputation, but how to rebuild trust before it collapses again. Inside a closed executive room, the airline president stayed behind after the CEO left. No cameras. No press. Just exhausted silence and the weight of what had happened. One senior executive finally spoke. "We almost destroyed ourselves because we judged a man in 10 seconds. No one argued. Because everyone knew it was true." Meanwhile, the CEO's convoy moved through the city without attention. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't angry anymore either. He was already thinking ahead. Because in his world, one incident was never the end. It was data. A lesson about systems, behavior, and blind spots in power structures. Later that night, a final message arrived at the airline headquarters. Not from lawyers. Not from PR teams. From the CEO himself. Short. Direct. "I will observe the implementation for 90 days. After that, we decide the future." No threats. No drama. Just time pressure. And that was worse than anything else. Because now every decision would be watched. Not for punishment, but for truth. Inside the airline, the atmosphere changed again. This time not fear, but responsibility. A junior staff member asked quietly, "Do you think he ever wanted revenge at all?" No one answered immediately. Because the answer was becoming clear. This was never about revenge. It was about exposure. And forcing a system to see itself without filters. As the night deepened, one final question lingered across both sides. If power reveals character under pressure, what did this incident reveal about everyone involved? The 90-day observation period began quietly, but its impact was anything but silent. Every department inside the airline now operated under a different kind of awareness. Not fear of punishment, but awareness of being watched through consequences already proven once. Security procedures were rewritten first. Then passenger handling protocols. Then escalation training for ground staff. But the real change was harder to measure. It was behavior. The way employees spoke. The way they made decisions. The way they paused before assuming. Meanwhile, the CEO remained completely out of public sight regarding the airline. No interviews. No statements. No media attention. But behind the scenes, independent auditors began reviewing everything. Every complaint. Every incident. Every internal decision pattern. And what they found wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern of assumptions that had gone unchecked for years. Inside a closed review meeting, an auditor said something that stayed with everyone. This wasn't a single failure. It was a culture that never questioned itself. That sentence hit harder than any financial loss. Because it meant the problem was deeper than people wanted to admit. On the other side, the CEO finally reviewed the first progress report. He didn't react emotionally. He simply noted patterns of improvement, and patterns that still worried him. Then he asked his legal team one question. Are they changing because they understand, or because they are being monitored? No one answered immediately. Because even they weren't fully sure yet. A few weeks later, the airline launched a public announcement. Not defensive. Not vague. But direct acknowledgement of past failures and new reforms. The world reacted quickly. Some praised it. Some questioned it. Some called it forced accountability. But inside the system, something had clearly shifted. Months later, during the final review stage, the airline president requested one last private call with the CEO. When it connected, he spoke honestly for the first time without corporate tone. We were not just wrong that day, we were blind to how we were operating. A pause. Then he added. And you didn't just punish us, you forced us to see it. The CEO listened quietly. Then replied. I didn't force anything. I only let consequences speak clearly. Silence followed. Then the airline president asked the final question of their entire journey. After everything, do you think people like us can truly change? The CEO took a moment before answering. Not because he didn't know. But because the answer wasn't simple. Then he said. People don't change from one moment. They change when they can no longer ignore what they've become. The call ended there. No closure music. No dramatic resolution. Just reality settling in. And somewhere between loss, accountability, and rebuilding, one truth remained. Power doesn't always destroy systems. Sometimes it exposes whether they deserve to continue. Now tell me this. When a system is forced to change, is it real transformation, or just survival under pressure? The final 90-day review report arrived on a quiet morning. No urgency alarms. No crisis meetings. Just a sealed document sitting on the CEO's desk. He opened it slowly. Page after page showed improvements across the airline system. Reduced complaints. Stronger training protocols. Independent oversight now active and functional. Security decisions no longer handled by a single unchecked authority. On paper, it looked like a full transformation. But the CEO didn't stop at the summary. He went deeper into the behavioral analysis section. And that's where the real story was written. It showed hesitation patterns in staff decision-making had changed. Bias-triggered incidents had dropped significantly. Escalation chains were now more transparent and accountable. But one line stood out. Long-term cultural stability, still in evaluation phase. That meant change had started. But it was not yet permanent. Later that day, a final private call was scheduled between the airline president and the CEO. The president sounded different now. Less defensive. More reflective. We have implemented everything you asked for. But I want to be honest, we are still afraid of repeating our old behavior. A pause followed. Then he added. That fear is what keeps us careful now. The CEO listened quietly. Then he responded. Fear is a temporary teacher. Discipline is what replaces it. Silence again. Then the airline president asked the last question between them. So what happens now? The CEO looked out of the window before answering. Now you operate without me watching every step. That is the real test. A longer silence followed this time. Because both understood what this meant. No more monitoring phase. No more external pressure. Only internal responsibility. The call was about to end when the president spoke one final line. Do you regret how this started? The CEO didn't hesitate. No. A pause. Because it showed everyone what happens when respect is treated as optional. The call ended. Months later, the airline continued operating under its new system. Incidents had not disappeared completely. But responses had changed significantly. And the industry began quietly studying what happened. Not the funding loss. Not the public controversy. But the structural shift that followed a single moment of disrespect. And somewhere in that reflection, a bigger question emerged across boardrooms worldwide. If one mistake can expose an entire system, how many others are still hidden until tested? 1 year later, the story that once shook the aviation industry had become a case study in corporate leadership circles. Not because of the $5 billion funding shift, but because of what happened after it. Inside airports, staff training modules were rewritten using anonymized versions of that incident. Not to shame anyone, but to teach decision-making under bias and pressure. The airline that once faced collapse was now being quietly monitored as a recovery benchmark by other companies. But behind all the reports and improvements, the most important change was invisible. Culture. People no longer rushed judgments based on appearance or assumptions. Security staff were trained to pause, verify, and escalate with accountability. Executives were required to justify decisions with documented reasoning. And that alone had reduced internal conflict dramatically. Meanwhile, the CEO had stepped back completely from active oversight. No headlines about him. No public statements. No celebration of what he had influenced. But in a private industry summit, his name was mentioned indirectly by a speaker. Not as a billionaire investor, but as a stress test catalyst for modern aviation governance. Later that evening, a journalist finally managed to ask him a question during a rare appearance. Do you think the airline truly changed, or just adapted to pressure? The room went quiet. Because everyone wanted to hear the answer. The CEO looked at the question for a moment before responding. Adaptation is what happens first. A pause. Change is what remains when pressure is gone. No one spoke after that. Because it wasn't a dramatic answer. But it was an honest one. After the event, as he was leaving, a junior reporter called out. Would you ever invest with them again? He stopped for a second. Then said. I don't invest in apologies. I invest in behavior over time. And walked away. No headlines. No final announcement. No closure statement. Just a quiet exit. Because in the end, the story was never about a plane incident or a funding withdrawal. It was about what happens when systems are forced to confront their own assumptions. And the question that stayed long after everything settled was simple. How many other systems in the world only look stable, until one moment reveals what's really inside them? Months passed, and the incident slowly faded from daily headlines. But inside the airline, it never fully disappeared. It had transformed into something else. A reference point. A reminder. A permanent internal warning written into leadership culture. Every new executive hire was briefed on it during onboarding. Not as gossip, but as governance history. Never assume. Always verify. Respect is not conditional. Those words became part of the internal code. Meanwhile, the CEO had returned to focusing on his broader global portfolio. He was no longer publicly linked to the airline's daily operations. But his influence was still quietly present through oversight structures he helped design. One afternoon, he received an unexpected invitation. Not from the airline, but from an international aviation safety board. They wanted him to speak about decision-making under high-trust failure events. A technical way of describing what had once been a very public moment of disrespect and consequence. At the summit, leaders from multiple countries attended. Airline CEOs, regulators, policymakers, security directors. Everyone knew why he was there. But no one knew exactly what he would say. When he finally took the stage, the room went silent. He didn't start with numbers or funding. He started with a simple line. Most systems don't fail because they are weak. They fail because they assume they are correct. That statement shifted the room instantly. He continued. What happened in that incident was not about one airline. It was about how fast judgment replaces understanding when pressure and perception meet. No one interrupted. Because every word felt uncomfortably universal. Then he paused briefly. And asked the entire audience a question. How many decisions in your systems are made based on assumption, instead of verification? Silence again. Because everyone was mentally calculating. After the session, a regulator approached him privately and said, "Your experience changed how we draft oversight rules." The CEO replied calmly. Good systems don't need dramatic events to improve. But most systems only listen after one. Later that evening, as he left the summit hall, a final thought was shared in a closing panel discussion without naming him directly. The real lesson wasn't about power shifting hands. It was about what happens when respect is treated as optional in structured environments. And that became the final takeaway across the industry. Not revenge. Not funding. Not controversy. But accountability embedded into process. And still, one question quietly remained in the background of every boardroom that studied the case. If one moment can reveal systemic weakness so clearly, what other weaknesses are still hidden, waiting to be exposed by time? Years later, the incident became less of a story and more of a reference point in aviation governance training. A quiet but powerful example used in seminars, boardrooms, and leadership courses. Not dramatized anymore. Not emotional anymore. Just studied. Inside the airline itself, leadership had changed again over time, but the structural reforms stayed in place. Independent oversight remained active. Security decisions were still audited. Bias training had become routine instead of symbolic. And most importantly, employees no longer viewed passengers through shortcuts of judgment. They were trained to pause before assumption became action. Meanwhile, the CEO had fully stepped away from any direct connection to the airline. Not out of conflict, but because his role in the system had already been completed. One day, during a closed industry research forum, a professor presented a concluding analysis of the entire case. He summarized it simply. This was not a conflict between a passenger and an airline. This was a stress test of decision-making architecture. Then he added, the funding loss was not the real impact. The behavioral correction was. That line stayed with many in the room. After the session, a young executive asked a senior regulator a question. Was it really worth it, one incident causing so much disruption? The regulator paused before answering. If a system breaks under one incident, it was already fragile. The incident didn't create the weakness. It revealed it. That answer became part of official training material later. Back in private life, the CEO rarely spoke about it anymore. But when asked occasionally in interviews, his response remained consistent. I didn't change the airline. I forced visibility on something it had stopped seeing. No pride in the tone. No anger either. Just clarity. And perhaps that was the final evolution of the story. What started as humiliation on a runway became a structural shift in how decisions were made across an entire industry. And still, even now, one question continues to appear in leadership discussions worldwide. If respect is removed from systems of power, how long can those systems remain stable before consequences expose them again? Much later, the story had already moved into textbooks, but the real impact was still quietly evolving in the background. Because systems don't stop changing just because the incident is over. They keep adapting. Inside aviation training centers, instructors began using a new framework inspired by that case. Not focused on the CEO, not focused on the airline itself, but focused on one core idea. Assumption vs verification in high-pressure decisions. Trainees were given scenarios that mirrored the original incident. A VIP passenger. A security concern. A split-second judgment moment. And they were taught to pause where the original system failed. Meanwhile, the airline had reached a point where it was no longer defined by the incident at all. It had rebuilt its reputation slowly through consistency, not statements. No dramatic announcements anymore. Just stable operations and improved trust metrics over time. In a closed executive reflection meeting years later, one senior leader said something that summarized everything. We didn't recover because we apologized correctly. We recovered because we stopped behaving like we were always right. That line became part of internal leadership philosophy. Elsewhere, the CEO was rarely mentioned directly now. But his influence was indirectly embedded in governance models across multiple industries. Not as a person to admire or blame, but as a case reference for what happens when systems are forced to confront blind spots. At a global policy discussion event, someone finally asked a final reflective question in a panel where the incident was briefly mentioned. If nothing like this ever happens again, does that mean the system is perfect? A pause followed across the room. Then an experienced regulator answered. No. It means it is being tested in ways we have not seen yet. That answer quietly ended the discussion. Later that night, the closing note of the event summarized everything in one line. Stability is not the absence of failure. It is the presence of correction before failure becomes visible. And with that, the story no longer belonged to one airline or one moment. It had become a permanent lesson in how quickly judgment can override respect and how costly that replacement can be when systems forget to question themselves. And even today, the final question still lingers in leadership discussions everywhere. If one assumption can trigger billions in consequences, how many decisions are still being made on assumptions right now? Years after the incident, the airline industry had quietly evolved in ways most passengers would never notice. New protocols existed everywhere now. Stricter verification steps. Mandatory bias awareness training. Independent escalation channels that bypassed hierarchy when needed. But the most important change was not procedural. It was psychological. People in authority roles were trained to slow down judgment, especially under pressure. Because the industry had learned something expensive. Speed without verification creates irreversible consequences. Inside a global aviation summit, the case was mentioned one last time in a closing keynote. Not as a headline story, but as a historical turning point in governance thinking. The speaker summarized it simply. One decision, made in seconds, revealed years of unnoticed structural behavior. That sentence stayed with the audience longer than any statistic. After the event, a young policymaker asked a senior advisor, "Do you think incidents like this are rare?" The advisor answered honestly, "Visible ones are rare. The thinking patterns behind them are not." That answer became the real takeaway for many new leaders entering the field. Meanwhile, the CEO whose experience had triggered the entire chain of change remained largely private. Occasionally referenced in academic discussions. Occasionally quoted in leadership modules. But no longer central to the narrative. Because the system had moved past the person. And into the lesson. In a final reflective report compiled by an international regulatory body, one closing paragraph stood out. This event did not create new rules. It revealed the need for rules that already should have existed. And that became the final documented conclusion. But outside of reports and frameworks, a quieter question continued to circulate in leadership rooms around the world. If one moment of poor judgment can expose systemic weakness so clearly, how many other systems are still one decision away from the same kind of awakening? Years passed, and the incident slowly stopped being discussed as a case and started being referenced as a baseline standard in aviation governance. A quiet shift had happened in the industry without most passengers ever noticing. Security checks became more standardized and less subjective. Staff were trained to separate perception from procedure. And escalation paths were designed to prevent single-person bias from deciding outcomes. Inside one of the major aviation regulation bodies, a final review paper was published summarizing long-term outcomes. It stated something simple but powerful. No systemic failure occurred again in the same form after implementation of independent oversight models inspired by this case. That line marked the real impact. Not the funding loss. Not the public attention. But the structural prevention that followed. Meanwhile, the airline that once stood at the center of the controversy had stabilized into a more disciplined organization. It was no longer reactive in decision-making. It had become procedural, measured, and review-driven. Executives who joined years later often didn't even know the full emotional weight of what had happened. They only knew the system they inherited. One day, during a leadership induction session, a senior trainer was asked a question by a new executive. What was the biggest lesson from that entire incident? The trainer paused before answering. The biggest lesson was not about punishment or money. It was about how quickly confidence can turn into error when systems stop questioning themselves. That answer was written down by many in the room. Because it applied far beyond aviation. In private, the CEO was occasionally still referenced in academic discussions as a catalyst figure in modern governance reform. But he no longer appeared in the center of the narrative. Because the outcome had outgrown the individual. And become part of system design evolution. At a global policy symposium years later, the final speaker closed the discussion with one last reflective statement. This case is no longer about what happened. It is about what was prevented afterward. And with that, the room understood something quietly. The real success of a system is not measured by how it reacts after failure, but by how rarely it allows failure caused by assumption in the first place. And even now, in leadership training rooms across the world, one final question is still asked at the end of the module. If assumptions once caused billions in consequences, how many decisions today are still being made without full verification, just waiting for their own moment of exposure? Years after everything had settled, the incident no longer existed as a breaking news story or even a famous controversy. It had become something deeper in the industry. A permanent reference point in decision-making culture. Inside aviation training academies, new recruits were shown simplified versions of the case. Not to relieve drama, but to understand consequence chains. They were taught a single principle that now sat at the core of modern airline governance. Never let assumption outrun verification. Meanwhile, the airline involved had long moved beyond crisis recovery mode. It was now operating under a fully matured oversight structure that had been refined over years. Incidents still happened occasionally, as they do in any large system. But responses were faster, calmer, and more standardized. The real change was not that mistakes stopped. It was that mistakes no longer escalated into systemic damage. In a global aviation policy forum, a final retrospective report was presented summarizing long-term industry impact. It highlighted three key outcomes. First, independent oversight reduced bias-based escalation failures significantly. Second, decision accountability frameworks improved consistency across airlines. Third, crisis recovery timelines shortened because internal escalation no longer relied on individual discretion alone. But the final line of the report carried the most weight. This case demonstrated that system maturity is measured not by absence of conflict, but by quality of response under pressure. That sentence was quoted in multiple leadership programs afterward. Somewhere far from boardrooms and policy rooms, the CEO remained largely out of public narrative. Occasionally referenced in academic discussions as a trigger event contributor to governance reform. But never positioned as the center of attention anymore. Because the system had evolved beyond personalities and into structure. At a final international leadership symposium years later, a closing question was asked by a moderator. If everything improved after that incident, was the cost worth it? A long pause followed. Then a senior regulator answered carefully. The cost is never the right way to frame it. The right question is what would have continued unnoticed if nothing had happened. Silence followed that answer. Because it reframed the entire story. Not as punishment. Not as revenge. But as exposure. And even after all these years, one final question continues to echo in leadership discussions around the world. How many systems today still appear stable, only because they have not yet been tested by the moment that reveals their hidden assumptions? Years after the original incident had faded into institutional memory, something subtle but important had changed across the aviation world. The story was no longer told as a dramatic conflict. It was taught as a decision architecture failure example. Stripped of emotion. Stripped of personalities. Reduced to patterns and outcomes. Inside training centers, instructors now focused on one core shift that came from it. How to separate perception from procedure under pressure. Not because people were incompetent before. But because pressure reveals shortcuts in thinking that normal conditions hide. Meanwhile, the airline involved had become one of the case study references for recovery transformation. Not because it avoided mistakes afterward. But because it changed how mistakes were handled. Internal audits became routine instead of reactive. Frontline staff were empowered to pause decisions when something felt uncertain. And escalation systems were designed so no single judgment could instantly define an outcome without review. The most important change, however, was cultural. Employees were no longer rewarded for fast confidence. They were rewarded for correct caution. In a global regulatory symposium years later, a final evaluation report was presented summarizing long-term system outcomes across multiple airlines influenced by the reforms. The conclusion was simple. Structural oversight reduces the probability of irreversible decision errors in high-pressure environments. But after the formal presentation ended, a senior policy advisor added an unscripted reflection. The real lesson was not about aviation. It was about how any system behaves when speed is prioritized over verification. That statement shifted the tone of the room. Because everyone understood it applied far beyond airlines. In private discussions afterward, someone asked a quiet question. If everything improved because of one incident, does that mean failure was necessary? A long silence followed. Then the advisor replied carefully. Not necessary. Just revealing. That word stayed with many in the room. Revealing. Because it reframed the entire narrative again. Not as something that had to happen. But as something that exposed what was already there. And even now, across industries that study decision-making systems, one final question continues to surface again and again. If one moment can reveal hidden structural weaknesses so clearly, how many other systems are operating today without ever having been truly tested? Years had passed, and the incident had fully transitioned from story to framework. It was now referenced in governance manuals, leadership psychology courses, and risk management training across multiple industries, not just aviation. The airline involved had also entered a long phase of stability. Not perfect. Not immune to errors. But structurally more resilient than before. Because the biggest shift was not procedural anymore. It was mindset. Frontline staff learned to separate emotion from escalation. Managers learned to question first assumptions. Executives learned that authority without verification creates blind risk. And slowly, the culture that once allowed a fast, biased decision to escalate had been replaced by layered accountability. In a global leadership research forum, the final long-term study on the case was presented. It analyzed outcomes across years, comparing airlines that adopted similar reforms with those that did not. The conclusion was consistent across data sets. Organizations with independent decision verification systems showed significantly lower rates of critical judgment errors under pressure. But the report also included a deeper observation. Systems do not fail because individuals lack intelligence. They fail when structure allows assumption to replace verification without friction. That sentence became widely quoted. Not because it was new, but because it was undeniable. Meanwhile, the CEO, once central to the entire chain of events, had long stepped out of the narrative spotlight. He was no longer discussed as a participant in conflict, but as an example of how external pressure can expose internal system design flaws. In academic circles, his involvement was described in neutral terms. A catalyst event. Not a protagonist story. Because the focus had shifted away from individuals entirely and towards systems. At a final executive roundtable years later, a senior policymaker summarized the long arc of change with a simple statement. The value of that incident is not what was lost. It is what no longer gets missed. That line ended the discussion. Because it captured the final evolution of understanding. Not revenge. Not redemption. But refinement. And even after all structural improvements, one question still quietly exists in every serious governance discussion. If systems only reveal their weaknesses when pressure exposes them, what weaknesses remain hidden right now, simply because they have not yet been tested? Years later, the incident had completely lost its emotional identity in public memory. It no longer carried names or headlines in industry discussions. Instead, it existed as a principal case in system design thinking. A silent benchmark used to train executives on what happens when speed, hierarchy, and assumption intersect without verification layers. Inside aviation institutions, the reforms that followed had become standard practice. Independent escalation protocols were now mandatory in most international carriers. Bias awareness training was embedded into operational certification. And security decision-making required multi-step validation before enforcement action. The airline involved had long since moved into a stable operational era. Its reputation had recovered, but more importantly, its internal discipline had fundamentally changed. Decisions that once would have been made in seconds were now filtered through structured verification. Not to slow the system unnecessarily, but to prevent irreversible errors driven by perception. In a global policy synthesis report published years after the event, analysts reviewed the long-term structural impact across multiple industries influenced by the case. The final assessment was straightforward. High-trust systems require high verification safeguards. Without them, efficiency can amplify risk instead of reducing it. That statement became widely adopted in governance frameworks, because it applied far beyond aviation. In leadership seminars, instructors no longer focused on the incident itself. They focused on the transformation pattern it triggered. How systems evolve after exposure. How organizations correct behavior under external pressure. And how long-term stability depends on internal accountability rather than reactive correction. During one final international governance forum, a senior moderator summarized the entire discussion with a reflective question to the audience. If a system only becomes safe after failure exposes its weakness, was it ever truly safe before? No immediate answer followed. Because the question was not meant to be answered quickly. It was meant to be carried. And even now, across industries that study decision-making, one final idea continues to repeat itself quietly. The real measure of a system is not how it performs when everything is stable, but how it behaves when one assumption is enough to change everything. And that is where the story ultimately ends. Not with an event, not with a person, but with a permanent question still shaping how powerful systems think today. Years after the incident had fully turned into institutional memory, the airline was no longer defined by it in any external way. No headlines. No controversy. No ongoing conflict. Just a stabilized organization operating under mature governance structures. But internally, it still existed as a reference point in decision reviews. Not emotionally anymore. Structurally. A never-repeat scenario embedded into training, audits, and leadership evaluation. The biggest shift over time was not in rules, but in reflexes. Employees no longer reacted first and verified later. They verified first and acted second. That single behavioral change quietly reduced escalation errors across multiple departments. In a final global aviation governance review, analysts presented a long-term summary of systemic outcomes influenced by similar reforms worldwide. The concluding statement was short but definitive. Independent verification frameworks significantly reduce irreversible decision failures in high-pressure environments. After the presentation, discussion naturally moved beyond aviation. Because the implications applied everywhere, systems relied on fast judgment. Security, finance, healthcare, transport, corporate governance. Anywhere decisions were made under pressure and assumption risk. At the end of the session, a senior global policy advisor delivered the closing reflection. We rarely recognize system weakness until it is forced into visibility. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. That line ended the formal discussion. Later, in smaller conversations, someone asked a final question that lingered in the room. If everything improved after that one moment, does that mean the system needed a shock to evolve? The advisor responded carefully. No system needs shock to improve. But many systems only respond after one. That answer stayed with the audience long after the room emptied. Meanwhile, the CEO's role in the entire arc had long been reduced to academic neutrality. Not a hero. Not a villain. Just a catalyst event in governance evolution studies. His experience was referenced in frameworks, not narratives. Because the outcome had become larger than any individual. It had become a design lesson. And in the final published synthesis across multiple industries, one closing idea captured everything that had unfolded over years. System resilience is not proven by absence of failure, but by the prevention of assumption-driven failure. And with that, the story reached its end state. Not in resolution, but in transformation. Because what began on a single runway did not end there. It reshaped how entire systems think before acting. And even now, one final question continues to quietly guide leadership discussions everywhere. If one unchecked assumption can trigger billion-level consequences, how many systems in the world are still one moment away from revealing their own blind spots?